Okay, I'm calling the committee of the whole meeting for Monday, October 18th, 2021 to order. Roll call, please.
Mayor Gaffino.
Here.
Trustee Carroll.
Here.
Trustee Curtis. Here. Trustee Gately.
Here.
Trustee Lowry.
Here.
Trustee Nedved.
Here.
Trustee Salazar. Here.
Okay, audience comments. Trustee comments. Discussion. Number one, Steve.
Thank you, Mayor. Item number one is Bill's just going to take us through our estimated property tax levy, and he's going to go over the police pension actuarial valuation. The purpose of this is just it starts the process where we look at our estimate, we bring it back to the board for approval, and then we bring the final levy back in December.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to walk through a presentation. I know there was a lot of information in the cow packet, so we put it up on the slides tonight to walk through it a little bit. Dave's going to be my wingman a little bit and help me get through the slides here. So really want to start off by going over the calendar. Tonight's, as Steve indicated, this is just the initial discussion of the underlying calculations to come up with a property tax levy estimate. On November 1st, the village board will approve the actual tax levy estimate that's discussed tonight, pending any changes. And again, that's just the actual estimate, not the actual approval of the levy. In November, we will publish our truth in taxation if necessary. And December 6th is the village board date where we hold our truth in taxation hearings and any SSA hearings that we need to hold. And at December 6th is the date we actually approve the tax levies and any related special service area levies. So property taxes represent about 18% of all of our general fund revenues. It's a very good inelastic revenue source that doesn't fluctuate with changes in the economy. Our 2020 tax levy, which we collected in 2021, is summarized to the right. As you can see, it was just under about 2.6 million in total property tax extensions, with police pension being the majority, about 55% of extensions, and the other major portions being corporate and liability insurance. As a reminder, the 2021 levy that we are discussing tonight actually funds next year's 2022-23 budget. So the village is subject to PTEL, which is the Property Tax Extension Limitation Law, due to the fact that we are a non-home rule community in Kane County as dictated by state statute. So per PTEL, we can only increase our property tax extensions from the prior year by no more than the CPI factor or 5%, whichever is less. For this year, it was 1.4%. One caveat to that is that we can capture any increases in EAV of the village due to new construction or any other factors that are allowed for, such as annexations or TIF recovery, which we actually have this year, TIF recovery of our EAV. And the one thing, as we've talked about in the past, is we cannot defer this allowance every year. If we don't levy enough to capture the extensions, we cannot recover it in a future year. So this is the summary that we're going to walk through a little bit more detail. As you can see, our total extensions last year were just under 2.6 million. Our estimated allowance for inflation, additional extensions would be about 36,000. New construction would be about 22,000. And due to the fact that we reset our TIF districts and a lot of those properties have a new base EAV value, that EAV has been essentially turned over to all the taxing districts, and we're one of them as well. So we're estimating right now, based on the numbers, that we would have an additional just about $9,000 of additional extensions available due to the fact that we have EAV that's essentially TIF recovery EAV. And that'll be a total for about 2.6% increase over last year, or about $67,000. This just a little more detail on our EAV. Our EAV is projected next year per the county to increase to about 603 million. The increase in current property value was a little less than it's been in the last several years. Based on the numbers that we have so far, it's about a 1.1% increase over the previous year. So that's a little different, where in previous years, we've had increases in property values for current property, increasing about 4, 5, 6% per year. The estimated new construction EAV is just over 5 million per the county. That's the equivalent of about 15 million in actual new construction value. And the amount of the EAV that we're estimating to be designated as TIF recovered EAV is about $2 million. And this chart just shows the new construction values and additional tax dollars over the last several years. A little hard to read from a distance, but if you take the 22,000 due to new construction and 9,000 for the recovered TIF EAV, that totals about $33,000 of additional extensions, which is reflected in that chart above there. So this shows the history of CPI over the last several years. As you can see, typically it's averaged around 1 to 2% during that time. 1.4% is a little bit less for during 2020 than we've seen in recent years, but it's pretty consistent with what it's been. There's been a lot of discussion about CPI in this current 2021 calendar year. Year to date, that CPI factor is currently 5.3%. I know there's a lot of commentary about, whether inflation is transitory. Are we still going to see an end of the year decrease like we typically do during October, November, and December, where it walks down a little bit? That's obviously to be determined, but it looks like, this current calendar year could wind up with a CPI factor that is higher than normal. And that's something that would be a good discussion topic next, obviously next year when the levy process begins again. So included in the packet was the annual police pension actuarial evaluation as of June 1st, 2021. Many of you have been on the board for a while. We changed a lot of assumptions over the years related to investment rates, payroll growth, and we kind of got our assumptions to a point where we feel they were very realistic. For this pension valuation included in the packet, there are no changes in assumptions for this year. That's the second year in a row. We had a 19.2% investment return in the police pension fund versus our 6.5% assumption. So that was a very good actual experience versus assumption. Salary increases were 3.32% versus our assumption of 4.29%. And this resulted in really the first minimal increase in our police pension funding requirement that we've seen in roughly 10 years. It increased less than 1% or about $13,000 for this upcoming tax levying year, which is really great. Our funding ratio went up from 59% to 63%. And our net pension liability, which we record in our financial statements, decreased about 2.8 million to about 10.7 million. So it was a really good year for the pension fund. Net pension liability went down, funding percentage went up. Again, you had a very strong investment return for the year, which is unlikely to continue in the near term, but it was a good year nonetheless. A lot of assumptions play a lot into different things. I just made a note there. If our assumption was for investments was 7.5% instead of 6.5%, our net pension liability would be 6.1 million instead of 10.7 million. So those assumptions really drive what those net pension liabilities wind up being. So this is a better, maybe more simpler explanation about the impact of the valuation. This is the property tax extension allocations by fund. This is where the property tax revenue winds up going after we receive it all. You can see the blue line is the police pension amounts. You can see how that's been allocated for police pension purposes, and it's increased from just under 600,000 to about 1.4 million over the last several years. And essentially what that does is that resulted in less dollars being available to fund general fund services in the general fund. You can see that red line going down while that blue line has been going up. And so you can see the change, the minimal change we had this year means we're finally seeing some stabilization in those numbers where we're actually maintaining what we're allocating essentially to the pension fund and versus the general fund. The bottom line is what goes into our liability in workers' comp insurance fund. And the amounts set aside for that are just allocated separately to that fund, and it's just a smaller portion of the overall tax levy. So again, these are the same numbers we went over before, just to recap. We estimate that total extensions would be about a 2.6% increase, or $67,000 for the upcoming year. A couple other notes. The board might recall 2019 was the last year that we had a payment on our library debt. So we had significant decrease in our tax rates during 18 and 19 as we wound up paying off that debt. And we're also beginning discussions on our SSA levies. These are amounts that were levied for 2020 for our 6 active special service areas. So those amounts will be reviewed over the next coming months, and a recommendation given to the board either in November or December for those SSAs. This just shows the line showing the village's total property tax rate. You can see it decreasing significantly the last few years as a result of paying off that debt and EAV increasing more than inflation. With a lower increase in current EAV for next year, we're anticipating that property tax rate being relatively stable. So levy considerations, we have, like we said before, about $2.659 million. Past practice has been to levy sufficiently to collect the CPI new construction, given the understanding that we can't go back and re-levy it again. We still have operating capital needs for future budgets that we're talking about. As we talked about tonight, we also had an increase in our liability insurance increase, the first one we've had in a few years. And overall, our tax rate, though, has been going down over the last several years, which is a good thing. So as we've talked about at the staff level, we feel like a recommended levy of $2.69 million would capture CPI, new construction, and allow us to have the benefit of that EAV that was in our TIF district going back to the taxing districts, including us, to be realized this upcoming year.
Hey, Bill,
Yes.
I have a question. Why is your recommended levy higher than our possible extension amount?
Sure. We always have a little bit of a buffer in that, and that's just been past practice to have about a 0.5%, 1%, a little buffer on that, just to make sure in case something's missed by the county, which has happened in the past, that we made sure that we levied higher enough to make sure we capture that.
So is it possible to do a levy and only assess the levy on new construction?
You're essentially, it's the same pot of extensions. You know, we separate the amounts that are available, but really what you wind up doing is setting your levy something less about what you expect to receive. And then you can say that you're going to be giving up inflation or giving up new construction or some portion of that, but it's not allocated separately like you just pick and choose. You just have to set a levy that's less than what you expect to receive and then do the math from there.
Every year I have the same concerns about putting another burden on our homeowners. And when you look at the fact that our pension fund is so well funded, and what is it, 57% of our tax levy goes towards funding that one fund. And then looking at the fact that we've got with Lincoln Valley, a new pool of residential, as well as I'm thinking forward. If you take a look at what's happened in the village to property values in the past year, we're up 14%, which means we're going to have a reassessment and there's going to be a big sticker shock because that is going to affect our property taxes. So, I mean, whatever we can do to try to keep the rates the same for our homeowners, I think now is probably a good time to do it.
Any other general questions or about the
No, I don't have any
calculations?
questions. I have none.
Okay.
All right. Item 2, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Item number 2 on the agenda tonight is our discussion about North Rodays 2022. As you recall, this year's North Rodays was modified due to the COVID, at the time, the COVID pandemic, because we weren't fully in phase 5 yet, and the committee was going back and forth on if the state was going to be open or not. And What ended up happening was a recommendation to the board to do a modified one-day event. It was held on September 18th in North Aurora Riverfront Park on a Saturday afternoon, and basically went from 11 till 10. And the North Aurora Days Committee just met last week and had their normal monthly meeting and went over everything from the September event, and felt that the environment was really good at the park, liked it, and wanted to pitch to the board the idea of moving North Aurora Days to the park regularly, as opposed to the Clock Tower Plaza where it's been held in the past. Clock Tower Plaza being a private property, not that it's insurmountable, but requires a license agreement. Talked about things like the fireworks, how we used to have fireworks in North Aurora Days, but as you know, we're going through a development process for something that's going to literally develop where the fireworks are shot off. So that's probably a factor in not being able to do fireworks in the future. So the committee went back and forth. This discussed a lot about both the location, benefits, pros, cons, and then they also talked about the dates. We've always had North Aurora Days first weekend of August, and there was some talk about whether the September date made sense. Committee ended up kind of falling back on August because in the conversation, although the weather worked out wonderfully this year, I think the main concern that I had heard at the committee level was that September is busy when everyone goes, especially early September, when you go back to school. There's homecomings on those weekends. There's school events, sports are kicked back up. First week of August, no one's in school yet, so you kind of have that put aside. Not to say there isn't, youth leagues and stuff like that, but so that's the long-winded way of saying that the committee was looking for board direction on whether or not to move it to Riverfront Park next year. Want to do that early because the earlier in the process, the easier it is for us to plan for it next year.
I actually think that's a great idea. Because I liked it back there. I liked the area. I thought it was easier for like police patrol. And I like the proximity to the river.
I like to add too, also, the committee felt because if it wasn't a fall, that volunteers would be a problem, for the different, the beer tent. If homecoming and things or school functions were happening at the same time, that parents usually go with the kids to homecoming and volunteers would be short too. So besides weather, like Steve said, we're looking at the same Friday, Saturday, maybe Sunday. We haven't really got that far yet, but definitely a Friday night, Saturday night event here. The police, they liked it as well. It was more secure, easier to maintain security. I know Public Works kind of liked it as well because it wasn't miles and miles of fence they had to put up and everything. Plus, we got kind of a home base here at Village Hall. We never had, if there was a bad storm or some catastrophe, we hadn't really nowhere to go, that clock tower. So
And we can run fireworks with the exception of the blue heron, right?
yeah. So if we didn't do the fireworks, maybe we could put a little more money into bands or something so we can kind of look at it and make it more
What about
attractive.
the only thing that I saw that I only was there for like 4 hours was the food vendors.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, it was a tough year, COVID and short notice. They didn't have enough help.
Although the food vendors, I tried all the food was
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah, they were
Well,
good.
You guys had the food vendors when the food vendors had food, which later in the night they did not.
They ran
And
out of
so the
food.
last
But see,
2
you have to eat
hours.
earlier. You have to be like eat dinner at 3 o'clock.
Well, I think, well, if you're gonna say there's gonna be food till 10 o'clock, then there should be food till 10 o'clock,
Yeah.
right? So there really wasn't food the last 2 hours, give or take. And very long lines for those couple of food trucks that did have something. I liked it there. I was there from about 4 o'clock on until the end. I think it's beautiful and picturesque, and I think that it made it feel more intimate in a sense because you are kind of all in a smaller space, and I think there's more shade there, which would be more pleasant during those hot afternoon hours if people come. So I'm all for it to have it here at the riverfront.
What would you do with the carnival?
I guess up for discussion. So we didn't really include Talk Carnival per se. Nobody really wants to come to our event. That's only 2 days. That's the first problem with the carnival.
We've never, since I've been here, we haven't had a traditional carnival. We've had a couple rides that we've rented at our risk. and then basically sold tickets back to try to make recoup the cost.
There was conversation, maybe some on the south side of the bridge for children, moon jumps, who knows, but some activities over there possibly. The thought too, though, is parents would like to probably be on this side, so there's some challenges, I mean, we got the activity center a lot, but that might not be around forever, so, but,
And you can't close off the street ever, right? I mean, you can't, you couldn't close the bridge and have a
we
carnival
talked,
on the
I mean,
bridge.
I don't know, it'd
it's a
certainly be
state
nice,
highway.
but, right, and it's the only
You
access.
you could put it on Grant Street, the carnival.
We've had carnival companies actually look at Oak Street shutting it down and didn't think that even Oak Street shut down was wide enough for a traditional carnival with big rides because of the width of the rides and the height and the power lines and stuff like that.
Shutting streets down isn't always the funnest. So,
Well, especially if the fire department or,
fire department.
Well, what about
residents,
the activity
Oh,
center?
yeah, the
lot?
fire department.
plus residents backing out, they wouldn't probably appreciate it, so.
that would be my question, if we're making it a beer garden focus, you kind of lose the family event idea. The other thing is, the nice thing about the clock tower is there's 4 or 5 restaurants and bars that take advantage of the fact that you're right there in that central location.
The last thing that the clock tower asked us is get a waiver from every single person that would visit there. So for liability and just,
Every individual that comes into the event.
yes, yeah. And it makes it difficult because here we're asking them, not a favor, but 2 weeks before that, we're writing them up for the garbage dumpster is a problem. Then all of a sudden we're, hey, can you help us out and use a lot? And they're like, hey, it's just not clean. It's,
I love this venue. I think it's
Yeah.
awesome.
I
But
think-
I think it's
it is
limited.
kind of limited. Maybe there'll be some different ideas. I don't think we just want to make it a beer tent gathering either, but that's where the committee can kind of buckle down and figure out some children's events and or teens or.
The North Aurora Days traditionally isn't held in just a clock tower. It's the clock towers where you have the food and the beer and the bands, but you have events like Touch a Truck and the softball games and stuff that may be in the future, may not be, but either way, they're spread out throughout the town. I mean, there are a handful of locations that could accommodate a carnival, beer tents, bands and all that, but they're within neighborhoods. I mean, there's only a handful of parks that are big enough to accommodate that, and they're surrounded by neighborhoods, so you'd have to move it into a housing area.
But I think we want to make it a family event. I mean, that's always the focus, so.
Well, what about just putting the little carnival rides at the activity center parking lot?
It's hard to find somebody sometimes,
Yeah,
that's the challenge.
But I mean, isn't that enough room for like a little
Yeah.
ride
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
or two?
they can walk across. I mean, I think Batavia had some small rides like that this year up their windmill days, whatever. They weren't the big carnival, but they had something that,
I mean, that's close enough to hear.
yeah. Yeah. So all that inclusive, it sounds good then?
Yes.
Okay.
And then in August is still okay then?
First Friday in August wasn't usually the first weekend, it's usually
First
first
Friday.
Friday, but you could make it the first weekend or the second weekend. But
I think it makes sense because September, you're talking about Friday football games, you got. all the
Homecoming.
other- Yeah.
yeah,
I think September, there's just many conflicts.
Potentially.
in the
Potential
volunteers, so. All right, thank you. Item 3, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Item number 3 is an open-ended conversation, a discussion, if you will, about video gaming in the community right now as it stands in our liquor code. So I'm going to try to hit this kind of in a succession so that it all kind of makes sense at the end. So Mayor Gaffino, as liquor commissioner, had been talking with the staff back and forth about our current liquor code and the definitions of restaurants, video gaming, and how that works in our community. Thought it'd be a good idea to open up the conversation to the whole board on how we regulate video gaming to get some feedback. The background is, as a non-home rule community, we can't regulate video gaming. And when I say video gaming, obviously we're talking about video gambling.
What?
Video gambling. So we can't regulate video gaming in our community. But what we do is we can regulated through our liquor code. So what we do is we tie it into certain liquor classifications. We put restrictions on it there. This way, if there's ever a violation of the video gaming that we set, the parameters we set, we actually have the ability to fine, suspend, or revoke a liquor license, which is obviously important to the business. And you need a liquor license through the state law in order to video game in general. So the liquor, tying into liquor code is how some communities really make sure that everything's on the up and up. The only way that you get around that is if you're a truck stop, which we do not have one, in which you can get video gaming without a liquor license. So in our town, we allow video gaming in a few classifications. If it's not allowed specifically, it's not allowed at all. So it's only allowed in our 3 restaurant classes, which is large restaurants, small restaurants, and limited restaurants. Limited restaurant just means it's the same thing as basically a small restaurant. It just has beer and wine only as opposed to a full liquor license. We allow it in we have 1 tavern license. It's allowed in the tavern license. And it's also allowed in the brewery license, the brew pub license, I should say. But it is not allowed in microbreweries or actual full-fledged breweries, which we don't have any full-fledged breweries. We do have 1 microbrewery, that would be Brother Chimp, and it is not allowed at that location. I think looking back at the conversation, that's probably because of the idea that video gaming was always going to be tied into a restaurant to some degree, and the microbreweries doesn't have an actual restaurant, doesn't meet that place doesn't actually even meet the definition for a restaurant. So we've never allowed video gaming parlors. And I think everyone kind of knows when you hear the word video gaming parlor, it's usually a small footprint store where gaming is clearly the first and foremost aspect of the business. Food and or liquor is ancillary. A lot of advertisement for video gaming, frozen foods, no full-time staff in the kitchen, basically people just monitoring the machines. And so we don't allow those outright. So in our town, in order to video game, and we'll go back to the tavern. Tavern's the only one where you don't have to have a full kitchen. And we've written that code it's very specific. So the 1 tavern in town is the only one that can have it in the future as well. So that we can have time to revisit it if another tavern ever wanted to reopen. The restaurants in town basically all share a very similar definition. To have video gaming, you have to have a full-time cook. You have to have basically a menu, a floor plan. You have to have a kitchen on premises, and then you have to be able to, you have to have a seating requirement. For large restaurants, if you have 75 seats in a multi-unit building or 125 seats in a standalone building, you qualify for video gaming right away. If you're a small restaurant or a limited restaurant, or even the brew pub or the tavern, they all have a smaller requirement, but they still need 75 seats. Or we put a caveat in there that said, if you can't put 75 seats in, after 2 years of being a business, you can go down to 50 seats. And once as long as you have 50 seats and you've been in business 2 years, you can now video game. That was specifically put in by the board a couple of years ago. Once again, it was to limit video game parlors who come in with very few seats. They come in just to set up their gaming machines and move on. As we've gone through this now, there's some considerations, and I wrote them in a very kind of open-ended way for discussion. There's 3 main considerations. Sometimes it's hard to determine what a parlor is versus a restaurant. And that was another reason why we added, so that's the first consideration, is about parlors in general. When we first set up the restaurant code, part of that was because we would get, and when I say we, it would be me and Mike Toth primarily, and then the liquor commissioner, the mayor at the time, would get people who would want to come and open up a business. Most of the time they were clearly parlors. Oh, hey, we just want to set up video game machines. Do you allow that? And we said, no, you have to be a restaurant. But it always went back and forth on what a restaurant really was. And so at that time, the liquor commissioner chose to just make that determination and not issue a license. And that was the way they kept parlors out. The flip side of that is every now and then someone might actually come in as a restaurant, but they don't meet our definition. Like, let's say a deli. A deli doesn't need to have a full-time cook, doesn't need to have a full operating kitchen. In theory, a deli could be an actual restaurant wants to come in town with video game machines, but they wouldn't meet our definition of an actual restaurant. So it makes it difficult. So that's one thing. And then restaurants do look when they come in town to town at which one, if they want video gaming. And I think it's become pretty predominant that if you're going to establish a restaurant with video gaming, because you know that it could offset your revenue the first few years, you're going to look at the towns that obviously allow it first. So that's the first consideration is gaming parlors, and we'll get to that in a second. Second consideration we have is how municipalities regulate it. It's all over the board. So it's really a la carte depending on the town. Some towns don't regulate gaming parlors at all or video gaming at all. They just follow state statute and let it happen. Some towns ban it outright, don't even allow video gaming at all in their town. And then we fall in what I like to think is kind of the norm, that we have a process. We're not home rule, so we don't have a separate process, but we do tie it into the liquor code. So we do have some regulations. Some places might do different overlay districts or different ways to allow it only in certain areas of town and so on. But every town is a little bit different, it seems. And the last thing to consider is that seating count and whether or not a seating count actually keeps parlors out, or does it actually keep restaurants from coming into town? And part of when we started looking at this closer, I believe those numbers were the seating numbers that the city of Aurora used, and that's how we ended up with those numbers when we were looking at different codes a couple of years ago. But there are existing restaurants in our town right now that have been restaurants for years that will never probably meet that 50 seat requirement. So technically, they wouldn't even be able to video game right now, and they've been in business for 5, 10, 20 years.
I thought there was an exception though, after 2 years of operation.
But you still need to have 50 seats.
Pardon me?
You still need to have 50 seats. So that's the thing. I mean, some of the small footprint restaurants, it's tight to get 50 seats in some of those restaurants. And, I'm just saying, so like there's one for sure that I know of off the top of my head. And there's one that's right now looking at video gaming that probably won't be able to have much more than 50 seats at the most. So right now, I think there's a few that would fall into that where they could be legitimate restaurants, but never actually be able to video game.
See, I've never understood why we have a seating requirement, because I think it should be up to the individual business to understand their business model and what they want to do and how they want to service customers. I'm of the opinion, as long as it's not violating any health or safety issues, it should be up to the business owner to decide the seating. To me, just to pull an arbitrary number and, say, well, that arbitrary number suddenly could be decreased after 2 years of owning the business. I mean, like you said, could this be prohibitive to, somebody who wants to put a small, maybe sandwich shop or something in the village? So I've never quite understood that. So I'd like to maybe talk about that a little bit more, because.
And that's where, and we're about to get right to those 4 questions that I'm going to ask. And to your point, it was an arbitrary number, and it has been more than effective to keep video gaming parlors out. It really has, because we haven't had one. We had one that tried to come in, but we put them in violation because they didn't meet the requirement of a restaurant. And now they're actually serving food. So like, not that they weren't before, but they actually have a full cook now. So those codes did work in that regard. But the question is that what the board actually still wants? And so that's what I think Mayor Gaffino was asking for. So go into these 4 questions with that background. The first question, I think, centers around video gaming parlors in general. And that is, does the village want to allow video gaming parlors? Or do you still feel that that's not a desirable business in town? If you want them in, or if you don't, either way, I suggest Mike Toth and I will probably write a definition. We don't have one in our code right now for video game parlor. We think the best way to regulate them, either if you want them or not, is to at least have a definition so you can identify exactly what that is. So we'll do that. But the question is, do you want us to look at adding those as a category of liquor license? Or do you like it this way now, where you want a restaurant, not a video gaming parlor?
I'd say no to video gaming parlors.
I agree. I say no as well.
I agree with that.
I don't see the need for a change. And I don't think we should say that the number of seats was picked arbitrarily because we're then admitting that our regulation is arbitrary. I think it was picked based on the number of seats that our existing restaurants at the time had available to some extent, or at least a floor that they didn't go beyond to keep them out. I don't think we should be adding video gaming. I mean, there's a riverboat 3 miles away. We already do allow it in our restaurants. And so if somebody chooses not to come to North Aurora, it's because they want a video gaming parlor. And if they want to go to Batavia or to Geneva or to Elgin or Aurora, let them go. To me, I don't think we should be, video gaming provides absolutely no service to the residents of North Aurora. It provides revenue, but it doesn't provide any service to the resident. It actually takes money out of their pocket. So I don't think we should be encouraging that type of an environment by expanding it even greater than it is. I'm okay with the way it is now, but I'm against any sort of expansion of it.
The only question I would have is some of these, I guess, open spaces we have in town, can you even get more than, can you fit 75 seats in some of these vacant buildings that may want to be a restaurant, but they can't? And part of being a restaurant now, they people do want to put gaming in there. Just like Steve said, the first year or two, that's going to pay for their bills. So that would be my only thing is I don't want to discourage potential new smaller restaurants to come in to an existing building that might be there or a storefront, and there's only 58 seats or 60 seats can fit in there, and technically then they're going to say, well, no, we'll just go down the street, to Batavia or whatever. So that'd be my only issue with the seating requirement in that sense is potentially turning down legitimate restaurants that want to come in, legit restaurant, not a person that wants gaming and then happen to serve food, but serve food, want the games to help pay, but because the actual space is not large enough, that 75 seat thing can't be met. So I'd be willing to be flexible on maybe lowering the 75 to 50 or something like that to begin with. But again, I certainly don't want to just say a company, someone to come in and say, I want to have games. And then, oh, by the way, I'm going to serve sandwiches, or I'm going to serve, what's A's serving now, Chinese food or whatever it might be, to get around that. That's what I think I'd like to see not happen. But to discourage a restaurant or something like that to come in because they can't fit the 75, I think that's something that's wrong as well. Is there a way where we can, if we don't want to change the 75 seat thing, maybe say it's for every 12 seats or whatever the math comes out to, you can have one game, so that, because what is it, the max you can have 6 games?
6.
So you have 75 seats, you can have 6, but if you have 50 seats, you can have 4 games or whatever like that. I don't know if that would, do anything to help, but.
The only thing I would say is that to my knowledge, the only people that have come to the village seeking some sort of gaming have tried to go around to skirt around
Absolutely
the issue of seating or restaurant definition, because it was evident that all they wanted was games.
Certainly.
And so I think if you're a legitimate restaurant owner, gaming's the last thing on your list. Does it enhance your revenue? Absolutely.
You know what, though, I would go around and ask a couple of restaurants that have it in town, and
it's kept them alive.
It kept them alive. So
Yeah,
I wouldn't say that anybody that wants a restaurant.
The issue we're talking about here is, do we want to allow it or not? It sounds like the majority doesn't. So, this is.
Well, we
gonna
don't want just gaming.
Right. So this is
Right.
the second part of
This is
the
the
bullet
question.
point
Oh,
here.
Yeah, parlors go.
So the
We don't.
question is, do we want it or don't it? It sounds
We
like
want
we don't
gaming,
want
no.
it. So
Right,
how
no.
do we strengthen our code now so that we're not doing this debate every
Sure.
Right.
6 months?
So I would recommend, it sounds like the board wants to keep the video gaming parlors out like we're doing now, which is
Right.
fine.
Yes.
What we do
Yes,
in
that's
that
right.
case is we still suggest that we tighten our code up, because we would like to define a video gaming parlor So that we have something to really like, kind of put our teeth into when we're going after somebody who's trying to come in as a video gaming parlor.
And it's going to give you guys a relief too, because it's going to be clearly stated and you're not going to have to waste time explaining to people why it's not going to float.
And Mike actually had some really good thoughts, but we didn't put him down on paper yet because we wanted to see where the conversation went first. But he's already got a draft of some definitions. As the second one is the definition of a restaurant.
I have a question, sir. The normal size restaurant or normal like building that gets rented out or leased is 1,000 square foot. Is that what it is? Is that a typical number?
Sure.
I mean, I'm just going to take Ace Cafe. You
Okay.
guys mentioned Ace Cafe.
That
looks
would be
to
a
me-
typical, right?
That's a typical restaurant. That's 1,000 square feet, correct?
It's,
How many seats are sitting in that place right now?
they had to put in 75 seats to get there.
Okay.
It was tight.
If that's the typical square footage and they can get 75 feet or 75 seats, I'm sorry. I'd say that's standard and that's the way that's what I would like to see. Now, if you get under 1,000 square feet, you get to 500 square feet, then it's half a restaurant.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Then you're down to a Subway, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Even
there's-
Subway's 1,000 square feet with the washrooms.
Yeah, there's a couple of restaurants in town that are, I don't know if they're the exact same size as Ace Cafe, but I mean, obviously Hookalida's very small.
What's the name of it?
Hookalida's across the street, so that would be hard to ever have.
Oh, okay.
Tecalitlan across the street, I think we counted it a couple years ago, they had around 43 seats. And they've been in business for a long time. So I mean, there are some smaller restaurants that have been here for a while that are pretty tight in there.
I mean, what if you added something in there, a minimum seat requirement, or you've been an established business in the village of North Aurora for at least 5 years? Or a time,
Grandfather clause.
right, that you can grandfather those businesses.
There is one, right?
But technically,
There is one.
there is a grandfather now, it's 2 years, but the problem is you'd even have to go further beyond it because we still have a seating requirement after 2 years.
No, but that's what I'm saying. You have your seat requirement, you meet the seat requirement, or you've been in business in the village of North Aurora for 5 years.
So then they have no seat requirement?
Right.
So the second question, and we're actually, the seating is actually the next question.
All right, there we
go. Sorry.
Jumped the gun.
Okay, but it's good. It's good. I knew this was gonna be, it's a good conversation to have. So we got no on video gaming parlors, so we're on a roll. Should the village change the definition of a restaurant? And the question becomes, it's that argument about, and I know deli, I can't really come up with other than coffee shop or deli, other types of food services that could possibly come in town that would want gaming, but not actually have a kitchen. But those were some of the things we thought of. Do you have to have a kitchen and a full-time cook, like someone actually in the back cooking fresh? And that's the way that definition kind of would read is fresh food, fresh and frozen, doesn't have to be all fresh, but when you
But how is that even considered a restaurant if you've got a food truck in the back? Then it becomes more like a banquet hall where it becomes a
Yeah,
catering
that's not a
service. I mean,
restaurant.
The
So I
definition of a
haven't-
restaurant is, it's got to have a kitchen, it's got to have.
In it, yeah.
I mean,
So
ice
for
cream
me to
doesn't
say I'm
require
gonna pull up a
cooking.
food truck
but,
and now you've got a safety sanitation issue, you don't know who's cooking it, are they, I mean,
Yeah, well,
to me, that's not a restaurant and I don't see what the debate is because it's a venue, it's not a restaurant.
Well, but Dunkin' Donuts has a kitchen, but it doesn't make donuts on site. The Dunkin' Donuts over by Tanner Trails has the kitchen, but it doesn't make donuts on site. They bring them in.
But you could say the same
Is
thing about any
that a restaurant?
You could say that about any restaurant that gets their, let's say their desserts, they get it from a bakery or something that.
Well, but
delivers
that's
all
their
the cakes
primary,
and stuff.
their Dunkin' is known for coffee and donuts. So that's their primary product. Is that a restaurant under our code?
So I would say no, because they don't have a full-time cook. And that's kind of where we went with Ace Cafe. They had someone sitting there with an air fryer who was just, if you ordered something, they would take it out and then they'd heat it up.
At first,
At first, not anymore.
they had frozen pizzas and that was their food.
I think we all know what we think of when we think of a restaurant, right? There's a cook, there's somebody back there making fresh food, somebody's ordering it, they're making it. That's a restaurant, not a food truck in a parking lot that then they're bringing it in just for the purpose of they somehow qualify for video gaming. I mean, I think that's what I think of when I think of a restaurant. Somebody's back there making food, you've ordered it, they make it fresh, they bring it out.
then my answer to question two would be no. That's how I would feel.
Okay, so you feel that that is leave it as full-time cook. Okay,
I like Mark's idea. I think it was Mark's idea where if the seating may not meet the requirement, but if they've been in business in the village for 5 years as a restaurant, then maybe they should be given that consideration because they're obviously here primarily to be a restaurant in the village. And so I kind of don't like the idea of people just coming in and the whole real main idea is to just is to have video gaming and then have the restaurant supplement the video gaming. That's kind of what we're seeing here a little bit, right? And I think that if I'm hearing everyone right, that's what they don't want. We want people to come in, have a restaurant and a business, and then maybe as an added benefit, they could have gaming, not the other way around.
That's where I'm at, because the ones I've seen so far is the gaming is the drive. The sandwiches is a sideshow. They don't care if they sell anything,
No, right, exactly.
you know, and it's like, to me, the restaurant should be the main event, and then, hey, we might get gaming later, fine, you know, and I think it's a carrot. So to me, keep it like it is, because maybe we can get a nice restaurant because they want the gaming, but maybe we'll get a nice restaurant in town because of
People want
that.
restaurants.
Yeah. But, yeah, so, and I like Mark's idea. Maybe there's some merit in, you know, having 5 years, definitely you're committed to your restaurant and you have a proven track record, and then you have to get a liquor license, because I know like Wackelitas doesn't, but I mean, he'd have to do that, and then.
do you have any thoughts on, if the answer is no for number one and it's no for number two, on number two, you know, you still have the option to modify the current definition without the seating requirement. We'll talk about that next, but about the cook, or is there anything you want to add? Is there anything you want to modify? And it sounds like you brought up the food truck issue, which is coincidental that that's the next item on our agenda tonight, is actually talking about modifying the food vendor, the mobile food vendor license.
So we have the food made on premise in the building, right? Is that in that language somehow? I'm not sure exactly how it's word prepared, all food inside, yep, in the kitchen.
So that was, and that partly, I wasn't going to try to tie this conversation to any restaurant, but last meeting, we had a restaurant come in here who wants video gaming, who specifically is cooking out of a food truck. And so the board said, it was, hey, what can we do to help them? So the only way to help them, if you wanted to do that, is to modify this definition. So if you don't want food trucks as a kitchen.
And they didn't have enough seating also. That was the second thing.
Yeah, and that's another thing. They won't ever get, they're actually a standalone building. That's a small building. That's another thing about the seating numbers we'll get to. That building is small. So even though it's a standalone building, it actually requires 125 seats.
It what?
It requires 125 seats.
Yeah, right.
To open with video gaming. So
I think that the market will drive a restaurant owner to open a restaurant. If they want gaming, they'll open a restaurant in a space that's big enough to accommodate gaming in the village. We shouldn't modify our code to accommodate one individual restaurant owner that picked that spot for rent or whatever market reasons. I mean, we have a code for a reason, and it applies universally across the board. We shouldn't pick and choose who we're going to help and who we're not going to. I mean, I think if that person wants gaming, they can go rent a space someplace else in the village. There's a million places to rent, not a million, but there's plenty of space to rent in the village.
At least then.
Part of what happened with the business that was here in the last meeting was, as I understood it, so Steve, correct me if I am wrong, is that the initial inspection by the fire chief indicated that the space would accommodate 75 seats. And then they made some improvements and they expended money. And then when the official word came, it would not accommodate 75 seats. And so it was a situation where you felt very badly for that business owner. And so that's kind of how we ended up here today, is that she was told that it would be 75 and she was kind of off and running, spent a bunch of money based on that, and then came back and said, no, actually, you don't qualify to have 75 seats. Is that correct?
She didn't have a kitchen in there also. I mean,
No,
some
this
of
was
that's
the food
not
truck,
all
but that's
accurate.
true. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
some of it's not
true.
all accurate. So she didn't have a kitchen to begin with.
No,
So
agreed.
she, right there, you can't have it. So no matter what the fire department told her,
The 75 seats was when she originally applied for her liquor license. She came back to apply for the video game and then provided a 75 seat to the village. Our staff looked at it and said, okay, that floor plan meets our code. What we didn't know was that the fire district was going to come back and say that the occupancy level was going to be less than
The
75.
occupancy levels, okay. And my understanding of that, the concept of that restaurant was it was a food truck that was doing well, and we're going to transition into a brick and mortar business. And that the food truck was not going to be sitting in the parking lot making food and delivering it to those inside. So that's what I was assuming was going to be going on with that business. I didn't realize that it was going to be a truck in the parking lot.
originally I think it was the food truck was going to be behind there just to use a deep fryer. That was kind of the original before.
Yeah, we're going to
I
have
sat
a
over
a
as
whole
a trustee.
conversation about this.
That was
next
the
item on the
conversation
agenda.
that when she came, it was going to be behind the building or somewhere. That was the assumption. Wouldn't be out in front and they wouldn't be making everything in there and then transporting it inside.
So
No on question 2.
yeah, no, so no on question 2. So 3 and 4, you can combine them because they're kind of just getting combined at this point, which is seating requirement or minimum years in business. Do we need to have that? I know one of our neighboring towns has a requirement. I believe it extends to every business that you can't video game the first year in general, which is obviously harsher than maybe what ours is, but also lighter on the back end because it's only a year versus 2 years to wait. So the question is, does the board want to change anything with the seating requirement? And does it want to change anything with the amount of years someone would have to wait if they don't meet the seating requirement?
I'll repeat what I said before. I would like to see the seating requirement stay the same, or for an existing restaurant that's existed in the village for a non-arbitrary number of 5 years.
I don't think we should have seating requirements for private businesses. I think we should leave it in the hands of our business owners who know what it takes to run a successful, profitable business.
I'm no.
So
So
what
keep
Laura's
everything
saying though, is
simple.
if there was no requirement,
The
so like a
question,
deli or a
Shouldn't.
sandwich shop.
Well, so what I'm saying is we've basically said we don't want to have gaming parlors.
Right.
So half the equation's already been solved.
Mhm.
The other equation is like a place like Hukalita, how many seats do they have in there? I mean, do they have 75?
No.
So how are,
That's why Mark said the 5 year, but there's people that come and they want to do a coffee shop, but have,
You could have
Six-
seating for 10
and so
people
what
and then
I'm
you have
saying
video
is
games.
why would we even limit? Why would we even have an arbitrary number when somebody obviously have done their homework, they've got a business plan, they've got a business model in mind. They know they need a certain capacity to remain profitable. Who are we to make that decision for them?
the slots would make them profitable. See, that's the thing. The slots generate a lot of revenue. If there's just a coffee shop with coffee pots and.
But now they will also have significant expense if they have to have a full kitchen and staff and everything else as well.
Yeah, if
Just
they-
a reminder, please speak into your microphones.
So if you had a small sandwich shop and you had a full kitchen, but you could only seat 15 people and they have video gaming, I mean, I guess, you can call it arbitrary or not, but is really the focus of the business, the 15 seats where people are going to eat a sandwich, or is the focus of the business, the 6 video games that they have there, or the gambling, whatever you want to call it. So
I mean, there's no doubt. I will tell you, I mean, I've dealt with the companies that come into Village Hall and ask to set up a restaurant, and you look at it and you're like, this is a video game parlor. And the seating requirement is one of those deterring things up front,
Right.
because there's, if you look at a lot of the video game parlors, they have a very small footprint. So I can see that is, it helps. But what it also does is it makes it difficult, I think, for some of our existing businesses, unless you just, here's an idea, drop the seating requirement, but still have a couple of years or some kind of timeline. I don't know if any, and this is just me throwing this out there, but I don't know how many video gaming parlors would come in and then operate with no video gaming for 2 years. And then all of a sudden, you know, if they're a deli, they're a coffee shop the first 2 years, I don't know if that's really gonna create a influx of video gaming parlors who are willing to set up for 2 years with no video gaming revenue.
But that'd be kind of counterproductive, a restaurant that if the first 2 years, that's when they're struggling. If it's a real restaurant, that was the thought of having the support from gaming to carry them through. So we have a good restaurant in North Aurora and thriving on year 3 or 5 or whatever. So I'm not allowing it for the first 2 years.
I think the minimum seat requirement drives square footage, and like you said,
Yeah.
it prevents them from coming in and having a small. They're gonna try and reduce their expenses as much as possible so that they can make as much profit in a video and skirt as much of the code as they can. So the minimum square footage eliminates that issue because now you've got the definition of a restaurant and you've got a minimum square footage or seat requirement that they're gonna have some skin in the game before we allow video gaming.
So the other question I have is, what about all the restaurants that comply to our seating requirements? We already made them require to have that seating requirement, so now we're gonna change and give just open it up for people to come in and it's diluting their business.
I agree with that,
So the answer to
but
this is
also,
yes.
I would say that I don't know if we've actually had, other than,
Answer to this question would be yes. Not a no.
The village continue to have seating requirements yes, my answer would be yes.
Yeah.
I was no to any changing.
so it sounds like we're actually keeping everything status quo. I don't hear any changes, and that's fine. I just want to make sure I have that right.
Hey, Steve, can
I'd
you
be
give me an
comfortable
example of
with
a restaurant in the village that's about 50 people, or
I
50
actually
seats?
think that when you own a restaurant, you kind of like sell food. And like if I go to a restaurant, I don't think about gambling, you know? So in my mind, it doesn't make any sense in the first place, but I'd be inclined just to keep it the way it is after this discussion. Here, listening to everybody talk and speak about their different points of view, I see no reason to change anything, and we're doing very well. I think the 2-year requirement, if there's less seats and they're in business for more than 2 years, isn't that the way it stands now, rather than Mark's 5 years?
Yeah, that's the only thing that I think that we still have hanging out there is if you're an existing business after the 2 years, do you
50
still need the
seats.
50
Right,
seats?
yeah.
Okay. Then I think that's literally status quo. I think we're good then, except we're just adding a definition for video game parlors. So we could actually, if anything, we're tightening our code.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Can you name a restaurant that you would say is about 50, a 50-person seat restaurant?
To Callan.
Have they asked to have games?
Oh, that's like 43. Okay.
No, they haven't.
Yeah, that's very small.
Is that it then for this?
That is.
See?
So we'll just add that. That's gonna be really easy. We just gotta add a definition for parlors.
All right, thank you. Item 4, mobile food vendors.
Okay. Item number 4 is a zoning issue, and Mike's not here, so I'm taking it for him. Item number 4 is about our mobile food license provisions. As you know, back in 2016, we started regulating mobile food vendors. We tightened it up in 2020, made sure the definition was in line with more than just food trucks. It covers trailers. It actually covers any non-motorized activities as well. So it could be a cart or anything with wheels, motor or no motor. And we actually had someone pop up this weekend that we were alerted to, and we found out that they just showed up on a property and started cooking and had a trailer. So we
And a tent.
and a tent.
Also, yeah.
So we were able to tell them that, they need to get a license. They can only be here under our current code. They can only be at a location 1 time a week for 2 hours at any given private property. And they can still move around the town at different places on the streets. We do have provisions that prohibit them from stopping on some busier roads. So there's never a traffic issue, but really has not been an issue. We have not had many issues with it. Recently, as we were talking about earlier, we had some conversation about the Route 31 district and whether or not a food truck can actually be out there, because technically speaking, that food truck, it doesn't actually meet our code currently, which is our code says you can't be on a parking lot or any private property for more than 2 hours once a week. When that business was first opening, they had alluded that they were going to utilize the truck and keep it on site and somewhere parked, along the building and use at some point they said they were going to use the kitchen, and then it was deep fryers out of it. And so as of right now, we have someone who's trying to open and they technically don't meet our mobile food vendor requirement, which is to actually keep them there for more than 2 hours every week. So what the staff had done was we sat down and we thought about it, and we came up with this idea that with Route 31, we actually ran it by the mayor just to make sure that he thought it was a good initiative. But what we had thought is Route 31 has struggled to get new businesses, and maybe as kind of an incubator program, what we could do is allow food trucks as part of a business if you lease or own the property just on 31 to see if we can drive people to come into those vacant businesses. And maybe that will help them offset the cost of putting in a full-scale kitchen. And I know this is, call me a nerd or whatever, I watch a lot of cooking shows and stuff, and I've seen this concept before where they actually do use a food truck outside and bring the food in. It may not be what we typically call a restaurant, but I don't think it's unheard of. And one of the thoughts was after talking to the property owner, or not the property owner, the business owner after the meeting last week, one of the things they indicated was that their model was to basically serve it kind of buffet style inside, do all the cooking and bring the food in and just have it on, it sounded like warmers when people walk up in there. And so, you're not really doing it made to order. You're essentially just keep filling the dishes, it sounded like. So anyway, if that is something the board is interested in, Mike drafted a amendment to our mobile food vendor license that would only allow a food truck to park on a permanent basis on a property, as long as it was on a property in the Route 31 district, from Sullivan to Oak, within, I think we define it within a quarter mile of the street. It's the same as our Route 31 sign ordinance description. And it would only be allowed in that district, in that area.
Are you talking about a food truck that drives up and sells food out of a truck like all winter long, or do they have like a building adjacent to it?
Yeah, so they have a building. What they want to do is
Do they
instead
own
of
the
putting in a
building?
full kitchen, they want to use the kitchen equipment in the food truck and actually cook out of it.
Okay, I have a question. Who monitors the safety of the food being prepared? Is it the county?
Yes.
Well, see, it's like, trucks that just drive around and I don't know how many county people enforce that law or even checks their food.
But that's the same principle as an inside kitchen. The county would do the inspection annually to an inside kitchen or randomly, depending on how they'd want to.
Who
do
does,
that.
so in our restaurants in North Aurora,
King County.
King County does.
But then isn't that theoretically putting our other businesses located outside of the 31 district at a disadvantage? Because what if they'd like to do something similar? So now we're kind of playing favorites, winners and losers. And then again, we go back to that whole thing where it's not really a restaurant, it's a event venue. I'm not even quite sure how that would even work.
Yeah, I have a problem. How would that be an advantage to the village, Steve? Is there some justification for it?
When
Because
you
I
move-
think we're trying to beautify 31, and I'm not sure a permanent food truck would lend to that effort. But that's just my thought. Maybe I don't understand all the details.
Sure, and if it could be regulated in a way that the food truck has to be parked at a side of the building or out of sight. It doesn't have to be front and center and people walking around a parking lot. It could be literally next to the back of the kitchen area where the doors open. The incentive would be is that you're allowing a business who, the most expensive part of probably opening a restaurant is the upfront equipment cost for the kitchens. You're taking someone who wants to move a food truck business into an actual brick and mortar. And that's their way of moving in, is opening up, using the building as the actual restaurant facility.
But it doesn't make sense with the business model. Your business model is I want to open up a food truck or I want to open up a restaurant. This is a hybrid. And again, we've got other businesses that did make that investment and turned into a full restaurant. So what I don't understand is why would somebody have a food truck and then say, okay, I'm going to skirt from having to invest in the community by having a kitchen. And if I don't like this location, I just drive my truck someplace else. And to me, I don't think that this is a good fit for our community. To me, it's somebody who isn't serious about investing in the village.
Plus an enforcement issue, like you just said, they're supposed to park on the side or the back and nobody,
Yeah,
well, I shouldn't say nobody ever does it, but the one hasn't done it. And it
I'm
becomes a
telling you, the
case.
county has a hard time finding food trucks to check their wagons. I mean, they just, they're
'Cause
mobile.
they're all
A
over,
restaurant,
yeah.
you're stationary, they can come in and check.
True.
I mean, what type of food? Was it, what type of food was you
It's that
considering?
barbecue. It's that barbecue, Mama's Kitchen.
The one on,
Yeah,
over by
but
the,
what if they sold tacos and they're right on 31 right
I wasn't
by
there.
Wacolitas? So now Wacolitas, who sells tacos and pays rent, has sales tax to the village. You get a mobile food truck and not only how we capture sales tax and that whole deal. And, they could be competing with them. That was my only concern is their competitor and they got four wheels.
so
and-
it's tacos?
Or just whatever, but you know what I mean? If it's somebody, a beef place or what if somebody had a beef truck and they park down at garage 31, parking their lot and all of a sudden, you got competition and it's half the rate because they don't pay a lot of things that the brick and mortar does. And then, like I said, enforcement is that can be a nightmare for one code enforcement person and just, I don't know, chasing it down.
But the change that Mike is suggesting or Steve is suggesting is that they are making an investment in the property because the food truck has to be tied to either a property they own or are leasing. So they've already made an investment in the property.
So we're not just talking mobile.
Right.
No,
parking somewhere.
I
they
mean, they
have to
just wanna
be
use
on
it
that
as a kitchen.
property. They just want to use the kitchen equipment.
So the truck's stationary?
The
at the
truck
property?
has to be on site. They wouldn't be able
It's a
to be
trailer.
operating if the
Trailer.
truck was off site.
Or trailer.
Oh,
I mean,
trailer.
every time they move the truck,
It's a food
the
trailer.
place has to close down.
Exactly.
So Steve, when it
Like
comes to sales tax and things that a brick and mortar restaurant would pay, would the food truck have the same
There's still,
liability?
it's still a brick and mortar building. It's got an address. It's just that they're using the kitchen out of the truck.
So it's all the same,
The
except the
building- yeah,
kitchen
the
is in
bu-
the truck.
The building is where they're doing the inside building improvements right now.
Mm.
So what do you call this thing? A restaurant? I mean, what is it?
So it's,
We could define it as a hybrid. But why couldn't we require them to make it no longer mobile?
Because they
Oh, I see
drive
what you're
around to.
Go to festivals.
Because the investment in the kitchen is far higher in a brick and mortar than it is in their truck.
but to your point, what you're saying is we still have to issue a manual license. And what you're saying is, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, is if they are truly going to operate as a restaurant, we could add some additional restrictions that say that you have to be on site so often. You can't just be like, today I'm open and today I'm not. When I talked to the owner, it was evident that they were trying to move into a building, but they were using the truck to go to shows because they were to make ends meet. They were still trying, they couldn't get it open in time with inspections and everything. So they're trying to do shows to make some money. So
Has anybody ever eaten there? The food?
They were at the
they were at
They're at
our
our
festival.
How do we capture the
one were
sales
they?
tax?
Mama's Kitchen.
Was that the one with some ribs?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're,
So-
they're required to report and collect and report all that to the Illinois Department of Revenue, just like a regular restaurant.
But I mean, if they have the food truck goes to Montgomery Fest and then, so they split all that out, whatever they sell in North Aurora or.
I haven't dug into the weeds on that in a while, but the concept is, yeah, if you're doing a sale in a taxable location of the village, you should be
Sales.
remitting sales tax revenue.
Steve, is this a temporary situation where they're trying to build a business and then eventually build an on-site kitchen?
No.
I'm not sure on that because they're obviously trying to get the inside open right now and they're putting some time and effort with the landlord to update the inside.
I would say the food was pretty good because I had those ribs at the,
I don't know. Which
I mean, I'd
sort
say
of
that for it.
place is. What-
I'm okay with this scenario. I don't have a problem with the food vendor that if you had a requirement that they have regular business hours, that they have to be a minimum per week, business hours that they have to be on site. I don't have an issue because I think you can hide it. And if you went into the restaurant, it's right down there on 31. If you went into the restaurant, you wouldn't know if they were cooking in the kitchen or if they were cooking in a
maybe if
truck.
the wagon was in the back.
I mean, all the other zoning requirements are
Right.
required, parking, health, all, you know, I mean,
To trustee Carroll's point too, you can even put that as a restriction that the parking of it on site has to be in a certain area, otherwise it can't be utilized.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that setup because they are investing in the lease. You probably, maybe you could even say that they have to show proof of a 1 or 2, not a month to month, but a 1 or 2, whatever number you want to use, lease, where you know that there's going to be some permanency, at least for 1 to 2 years. They're tied to that site.
And if they do good, maybe it'll be an incubator for another spot in town that they locate to.
Ideally, if they were very successful with that business and truck, maybe they could build a business and eventually become a regular restaurant. So I think it might be worth at least trying it and seeing if we can attract some additional businesses.
I think one of the things that staff wants to do moving forward is to kind of, Mike's had this vision that if we talk about economic development, that it's probably better instead of painting with a broad brush to really, each portion of the village has a different feel depending on where you're at, different types of restaurants, different types of ancillary businesses nearby. And maybe the better way to approach it is to kind of look at each area one by one, just like the auto mall. We look at the auto mall, it's obviously where they sell a lot of cars. So the things that are done around there, the access points, the beautification to the medians is big to their selling point of their vehicles. Is you kind of look at these as areas of how can you create development in each individual area? What is reasonable to get things moving?
Hey, Steve, what's gonna happen when you tell this lady that she's not gonna have gamings?
Well,
When's her lease up? It's like 2 more months, right?
It sounds like it's not too much further. And you know what, truth be told, they may never open there. We don't know.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean,
It was pretty clear that all she cared about was gaming. I mean, right? I mean, when she was here last week, for everybody that was here, it was pretty clear.
I think that
that's-
they have that food truck and they've been around for a while, I think.
They were almost
but-
like using the building to get gaming is the feel I got, right?
but when they first approached, they approached as a restaurant. 100%. It wasn't until a couple months into it, I believe, that they actually came back and said, hey, we'd like to look, and they were going to get a liquor license.
Yeah,
And then they started inquiring about video gaming.
I don't know.
Bless you.
But that's what I brought up at the last meeting, our current, she doesn't meet 2 of our requirements to video game. That's what we were bringing up last week.
So we good then?
Yeah, what I'm gonna do is I'll go back with Mike. We'll come up with some regulations for on-site, including parking and regular business hours, and we'll go from there.
All right. We're gonna have exec session, so I'll have a motion to adjourn and then we won't meet afterwards. So
Motion to adjourn to go to exec session.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Same sign? Okay.